In Ottawa, in the 1980s, a federal laboratory ran one of the world's most respected acoustics research programs. Much of Canada's loudspeaker industry traced its lineage to that building. Good sound, it taught, was something a chamber could prove. Roughly 200 kilometers east, in Montreal, a mathematics teacher set a small wooden cabinet on a table. It stood shorter than a stack of books and could be carried in one hand. He had never worked in that laboratory. He had no acoustics degree, no research budget, no chamber of his own. What he had were 3 sentences about what a loudspeaker owed the person listening to it. The industry was built on measurement. That box was built on a belief. Nearly 4 decades later, the laboratory's doctrine still underpins loudspeaker design worldwide. And the company that grew out of that cabinet still assembles speakers in the northeast of Montreal and ships them to more than 50 countries. But the belief came before the box, and it did not begin in a workshop. It began in a shop, in front of a wall of loudspeakers, in the ears of a man who kept going home disappointed. This channel documents Canada's audio industry. The speaker makers, the amplifier builders, the record plants, and the broadcast rooms. From the rise, through the reach, to whatever came after. If that history matters to you, consider subscribing. It's free, and it keeps these stories in circulation. The story begins in a Montreal classroom in the early 1980s. Vince Bruzis taught mathematics at a Montreal high school. He marked assignments, ran a classroom, and went home to records. Music was not a sideline for him. It was the reason the rest of the week was tolerable. So in the early 1980s, like thousands of Canadians in that decade, he went shopping for loudspeakers. He went to a lot of shops. He listened to a great many speakers, and by his own account, every one of them let him down in a different way. Some were exhausting. They sounded impressive for 20 minutes and unbearable after an hour, and a listener would find reasons to get up and leave the room without quite knowing why. Some had a listening window so narrow it amounted to a single chair. Sit in the middle, and the illusion held. Move over one seat and it collapsed. A speaker like that could not be shared. It turned music into a private appointment in a room built for company. And some simply wore out. They sounded one way in the showroom, another way after 3 years, and worse after 10. The suspension going soft, the character drifting, the thing quietly becoming a different loudspeaker than the one that had been paid for. Most shoppers would have picked the least objectionable pair and gone home. Bruzis did something stranger. He wrote the complaints down as rules. 1. A loudspeaker must never tire the listener. 2. It must be right from every seat in the room, not one. 3. It must still be worth owning in 20 years. 3 sentences, no equations, no laboratory, no funding. Just a specification written from the wrong end. Starting with what the listener owed nothing to and working backwards towards the hardware. That was an unusual place for a Canadian speaker to begin, because Canada already had a better funded answer. 200 kilometers west, in Ottawa, the National Research Council operated an acoustics program that had become the intellectual spine of the domestic industry. Floyd Toole conducted research there through the 1970s into how listeners actually perceive loudspeakers, and Paul Barton of PSB began development work at the facility in 1974. In the years that followed, most of the country's significant loudspeaker makers, PSB, Paradigm, Axiom Audio, Energy, and Mirage among them, could trace their design lineage back to that building. The tool at the center of it was the anechoic chamber, a sealed room lined with absorbent wedges so that no surface reflects sound, letting a microphone hear a loudspeaker on its own, with the room subtracted. It is an extraordinary instrument. It is also nothing like a Canadian living room, which has a carpet, a sofa, a coffee table, a window, and a wall the speaker gets pushed against, because that is where the furniture allows. Bruzis had no chamber. He had a set of tables he had worked out himself, a workshop, and a pair of ears he trusted more than he probably should have. And he made the hardest possible wager with them. He decided the box should be small. The physics were not on his side, and they are worth stating plainly, because everything that follows depends on them. Inside a sealed or ported cabinet, the trapped air behaves like a spring pushing back against the woofer cone. A large cabinet holds a soft spring, and the cone can travel far and slowly, which is what low frequencies require. A small cabinet holds a stiff one. The cone fights it, gives up earlier, and the bass thins out. That is the whole reason deep bass had always arrived in furniture-sized enclosures, and the whole reason a small speaker promising low frequencies was assumed to be an advertisement rather than a product. Bruzzesi's position was that the stiffness was a problem to be engineered around rather than a verdict, and that a small cabinet, done properly, would serve all three rules better than a large one. A small box has less panel area to vibrate and color the sound, which serves Rule 1. It presents a smaller obstacle to the sound leaving it, which widens the listening window and serves Rule 2. And a design that is not straining its drivers to fill a large volume should age more gracefully, which serves Rule 3. The company was founded in 1987. Company histories place the first speaker either in that year or after a period of development in 1989. It was called the Model 1. It stood roughly 12.5 inches high, 6.5 wide, 9 deep, and weighed about 9 pounds. A 5-inch class mid-bass driver, a 1-inch tweeter, a stand underneath it. The stated targets were accurate phase behavior, a wide and stable soundstage, and bass extension that had no business coming out of an enclosure that size. The construction was where the money went. Totem has long described using a borosilicate compound applied inside the cabinet to damp panel resonance and crossovers, the filter networks that divide the signal between drivers, assembled by hand rather than stamped out on a board. The name came from outside the workshop. The company has explained the totem as an entity that chooses a person and then guides them through their life, and adopted it as a statement of what a loudspeaker was supposed to do for a listener over decades rather than over an audition, which left one problem, and it was not an engineering problem. The Model 1 cost as much as a floor-standing loudspeaker, and in some rooms more. In a market where buyers had spent 30 years converting size into value, where the bigger cabinet was obviously the better one, because it was obviously more, Totem was asking a Canadian shopper to pay tower money for something that fit in a bookshelf. Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 3. Not one of them could be printed on a spec sheet. Not one of them could be settled by a chart on the wall of a showroom. They could only be proven by making somebody stop talking and sit down. And so the box had to be carried into a shop, set on a stand, and played in front of someone who had already decided that something that small could not be serious. The demonstration was always the same, and it always worked the same way. A dealer would set the pair on stands, step back, and put a record on. For the first few seconds, the room would do what rooms do, and then it would stop doing it. The two cabinets would go quiet as objects. The sound would come loose from them and stand in the air between them, spread wide, with height to it, and with performers occupying positions that had nothing to do with where the wood was. The technical term is imaging, the ability of a stereo pair to place instruments at specific points in space rather than smearing them across the front wall. And the Model 1 did it with a completeness that people found faintly ridiculous given what they were looking at. Reviewers noted for decades afterward that the speakers could vanish inside a small listening room. That last detail mattered more in Canada than the marketing ever said out loud. A tower loudspeaker needs floor, and it needs distance, and it needs a room that will forgive it. A one-bedroom apartment on the plateau, or a rented flat in a Toronto semi with radiators under the windows offers none of those. The Model 1 asked for a stand and about 2 feet of breathing room behind it. For an enormous number of Canadian listeners, that was the difference between owning a real loudspeaker and owning nothing. Word moved the way it moved in that era, slowly, through print, and through people who had heard the thing. Canadian readers met the name first, Audio Ideas Guide, the enthusiast magazine published by Andrew Marshall, covered the Model 1 Model 1 in a 1988 issue, and one reader of that issue would later describe it as the moment a cool-sounding little speaker lodged itself in his head 7 years before he finally owned a pair. Small circulation, long half-life. That is how a company with no advertising budget and one product gets into the conversation. Then the demonstrations began doing the work outside the country. By one American reviewer's account, he was pulled in off Broadway by a friend who worked at a Manhattan dealer, sat down without much interest, and heard a pair of unfamiliar speakers playing a tom-tom club track, sounding, to his ear, far larger and far more alive than anything that size had any right to. When the demonstration ended, he got up and went around the back of the cabinet to find out who had built it. The answer was a 2-year-old company in Montreal. That is Rule 1 and Rule 2 being settled in about 3 minutes, in front of a person who had not agreed to be convinced of anything. And once the wager was working, Bruzzese pushed it to its limit. The Manitou arrived around 1990, and it was the most extreme thing Totem would build for a very long time. It used isobaric loading. 2 woofers mounted one directly behind the other, sharing a sealed pocket of air between them so that the pair moves as a single unit and the trapped volume behind them behaves as though the cabinet were roughly twice its actual size. It is a way of buying box volume without buying box. Lynn had used the principle in the 70s. Almost nobody was using it at this price, in a cabinet a person could carry under one arm. It worked. It also came with a bill. The original Manitou ran a pair of 7-inch woofers with a crossover at 4 kHz, a nominal impedance of 4 ohms, and a sensitivity of about 85 decibels, which in plain terms means a loudspeaker that converts very little of an amplifier's output into sound and presents a difficult electrical load while doing it. The published amplifier requirement ran from 40 watts to 200. So the pitch at the counter became genuinely awkward. Here's a small speaker. It costs more than the large ones. And it will need an amplifier that costs more than it does. There was no way to soften that, and Totem did not try. The company was, in effect, asking the Canadian retail floor to sell physics that could not be photographed. Around it, the catalog began to fill in. The Shaman, a 5-way floor stander, launched in 1991 and became a reference point the company would draw on years later when it started building multi-driver models designed to disappear into walls and ceilings. The Model 1 itself was revised into the Model 1 Signature, manufactured from 1997 to 2008, with upgraded crossover components, silver internal wiring, and 2 sets of binding posts so the speaker could be bi-wired. None of this came from a laboratory. There was no chamber, no published research program, no white paper explaining why the small box should have won. There was a set of rules, a workshop, and a distribution model that depended entirely on one thing continuing to be available: a room with 2 speakers, a chair, and enough silence in it for a person to change their mind. Totem did not win by measuring better than anyone else. It won by making people sit down. Over the next 20 years, those chairs would get harder and harder to find. By the mid-90s, the boxes were leaving Montreal in numbers no one in that first workshop had planned for. By the middle of the 1990s, Totem was no longer a company with a speaker. It was a company with a catalog. The names arrived steadily through that decade and the one after it: Tot, Rock, Arrow, Staff, Hawk, Forest, Winds, Dreamcatcher. Some were monitors in the Model 1 mold. Some were floor standers, but narrow ones, built on a footprint that stayed closer to a fence post than a wardrobe. The house rule held across all of them. Where another manufacturer would answer a request for more output by widening the cabinet, Totem answered it by making the cabinet taller and leaving the width alone. That consistency turned out to be worth more than anyone at the company could have predicted, because the North American living room was about to reorganize itself around exactly that shape. Home theater arrived in force in the second half of the 90s. The format demanded 5 loudspeakers and a subwoofer, and it demanded them in a room where 4 of the 5 had to go somewhere, a person would still walk past every day. Suddenly, a Canadian family shopping for surround sound was not asking for the biggest speaker on the wall. They were asking for the smallest speaker that would not embarrass itself. Totem had been answering that question since 1987. For the first time in the company's history, the market walked toward it rather than the other way around. A Dreamcatcher package could be sold to a household that had never heard of the Model 1 and had no interest in a listening chair, and it worked. Because the engineering underneath it had been developed for a customer who cared enormously. The business grew accordingly, and it grew into a building. The company's operations consolidated into a facility of roughly 30,000 square feet in an industrial district in the northeast end of Montreal, housing research and development, operations, assembly, and shipping under one roof. The public face of it was deliberate. Reports from visitors describe a lobby finished in hardwood and decorated with North American indigenous motifs, and a large demonstration room where dealers were brought in to listen, with wine and cheese laid on. It was a factory that had been designed on the assumption that people would come and sit in it. They came from a long way. Totem product was reported to be distributed in 53 countries, a figure that belongs to a company selling out of a single Canadian city with no parent conglomerate behind it, no licensed brand portfolio, and no second factory anywhere. And it stayed a family business while it did that. Vince Bruzisi's son, Nico, came into the company handling purchasing and logistics. Lucy Lentini, by the time of the 35th anniversary, had spent 25 years as the public face of the firm to its dealers and distributors. The people who answered the phone in Montreal were the same people, year after year, which is a small thing that specialist retailers notice and remember. Then came the anniversaries, and with them the first sign of what the company intended to do with its own history. In 2007, 20 years in, Totem built a limited edition called The One. The same year brought the Tribe series. 2 years after that, in 2009, came the first generation of the Element line, positioned at the top of everything the company made. The Element series is where the belief stopped being a philosophy and became a piece of machined metal. The problem it was built to solve is one that every loudspeaker has and almost every loudspeaker accepts. A conventional woofer is driven by a voice coil sitting inside the gap of a ring-shaped magnet. When the cone is at rest, the coil sits in the strongest part of the magnetic field. When the cone travels, which is precisely when the speaker is working hardest, at low frequencies and high volume, the coil moves out of that field. The force driving it goes soft. The motion stops tracking the signal. What the listener hears is a bass note that arrives late, hangs on too long, and blurs everything behind it. Totem's answer was to build a motor that does not let the coil leave. The company's Torrent driver surrounds the voice coil with neodymium magnets arranged, so that the coil remains inside a strong field across its full range of travel. In the 7-inch version, that meant a cradle holding an array of individually magnetized finger-shaped magnets, 17 of them, by the company's description. The 6-inch version used a more conventional magnet structure to reach a similar end. That architecture bought Totem something it had wanted since the first workshop. Because the Torrent behaves consistently across its entire operating range, the company runs it without a crossover in its path. The crossover, the filter network that splits an incoming signal and routes the high frequencies to the tweeter and the low frequencies to the woofer, is standard equipment in essentially every multi-driver loudspeaker made. It is also a set of components the music has to pass through before it reaches the driver, and every one of them does something to the timing and phase of what comes out the other side. Removing it from the woofer's path means the signal arrives at the cone uninterrupted. Almost nobody does this, because it only works if the driver is good enough to police itself. Totem's position was that it had built one that could. Rule 1. A loudspeaker must never tire the listener. Is the entire reason the Torrent exists. Every part of that motor is aimed at the same outcome, bass that starts and stops when the recording says it should. so that an hour of listening does not become work. The cost of that conviction shows up on the shop floor in hours. By the company's account, the chassis and motor structure of the 7-inch Torrent are micro-machined and hand-assembled from more than 30 pounds of aerospace-grade aluminum, stainless steel, and other alloys, and the process takes over 10 hours per driver. What comes off the bench at the end weighs about 10 pounds. One driver, 10 hours of labor, 30 pounds of raw metal reduced to 10. 10 hours for a single woofer, in a decade when most of the industry had started measuring time in how quickly a container could be unloaded. The line kept developing. In 2018, Totem introduced the second generation of the Element series, built around a revised Torrent V2. And in October 2022, the company opened the doors of the Montreal building and threw a party for 35 years, with dealers and industry people walking the same floor where the drivers were assembled. It was, by any reasonable measure, the summit. A mathematics teacher's 3 rules had become a 30,000 square foot facility, a 53-country distribution map, a second generation in the business, and a proprietary motor that no competitor had bothered to copy because copying it would have cost more than it was worth. The party was in October 2022. The room it celebrated, 2 speakers on stands, 1 chair set between them, had been leaving Canadian homes for 20 years already. Nothing went wrong at Totem. That is the difficult thing about this part of the story, and it is the reason it takes 20 years to tell. There is no bankruptcy here, no fire sale, no founder walking out of a building for the last time. The company kept designing, kept building, kept shipping. What came apart was everything the company had been standing on: the factories around it, the counters that sold it, and the room it was invented for. Start with the factories. Through the 2000s, the ground under Canadian loudspeaker manufacturing shifted. Several long-established domestic firms changed hands, were folded into larger international groups, or moved the physical work of building cabinets and drivers offshore. It was not a scandal, and it was not a failure of nerve. It was arithmetic. Not every Canadian maker went that way. Some stayed independent and kept building at home. But the direction of travel was unmistakable, and it changed what a Montreal factory was competing against. The arithmetic was container arithmetic. A cabinet built and veneered overseas, shipped 40 feet at a time, landed in a Canadian warehouse cheaper than the same cabinet cut in Quebec. So did drivers. So did crossover components. Every year the gap widened, and every year it applied more pressure to the one number a specialist manufacturer cannot control: the price the speaker wears on the shelf, next to something that looks similar and costs half as much. Totem did not pretend to be immune. Like Axiom Audio in Ontario, it has at times had certain models produced overseas in order to keep retail pricing within reach of the people it wanted buying them. The company's own materials have described its entry-level kin range as manufactured offshore, with the rest of the catalog built in Montreal. That line, this side of the catalog here, that side of the catalog there, is the most honest thing in this documentary, and Totem did not hide it. A company that had spent 20 years telling dealers exactly how its speakers were made was not going to start being vague about where, and it fought the line where it could. When Totem developed the Skylight, a mini monitor priced well below the models the brand was known for, the obvious move was to send the whole thing overseas. Instead, the cabinets were completed by a cabinet maker and shipped in on pallets, with final assembly done at the Montreal facility. It is a compromise, and it is also a refusal. The expensive part of the work, the part that determines whether the speaker obeys the 3 rules, stayed in the building. There is a further complication, and it applies to almost every boutique loudspeaker company on Earth. A speaker described as made in Canada is, in most cases, a Canadian design and a Canadian assembly wrapped around transducers built elsewhere. Totem specifies its drivers in detail and has them manufactured to that specification by outside transducer specialists, a normal, unremarkable practice, and one that most of the industry relies on. The reason it matters here is that it puts a price on the exception. Building a driver entirely in-house, start to finish, is a decision a company makes on purpose, knowing what it costs. And then there is the exposure that comes with the map. A manufacturer selling into more than 50 countries out of a single Canadian city carries a structural risk that never appears in a review. Most of the revenue arrives in currencies that are not the one used to pay the people assembling the speakers. Most of the customers are on the far side of a border. Exchange rates, freight costs, and trade conditions are not incidental to a business like that. They are the weather it works in, and it does not get a vote. That was the supply side. The demand side was worse, and it was crueler, because it started as a gift. Home theater had been the best thing that ever happened to Totem. It put small speakers in ordinary Canadian houses in numbers a two-channel company could never have reached alone. But look at what the format actually did to the room while it was doing that. It took 2 loudspeakers and a chair. It replaced them with 5 loudspeakers, a subwoofer, and a screen. And the moment a screen entered the room, the listening position stopped being a listening position. Nobody arranges a family around a television the way a person arranges themselves between a stereo pair. The seat moved to the sofa. The sofa is against the wall, and it is wide, and everyone on it is off-center. Rule 2. A loudspeaker must be right from every seat in the room, not one, had been Totem's answer to a problem the industry ignored. Now the industry had solved that problem a different way. It had stopped caring where anyone sat. Then the room got simpler and simpler again. The sound bar arrived. One box, under the television, no stands, no wire running along the baseboard, no argument about furniture. It was never going to sound like a pair of forests. It did not need to. It needed to be better than the television's own speakers and easier than anything else. And it was both. Then Bluetooth speakers, which asked nothing at all. No amplifier, no placement, no cable. Convenience did not defeat quality in an argument. It defeated it by never having the argument. And then streaming and earbuds finished the job. The soundstage, the wide, deep, three-dimensional image that Totem had built an entire company around, that dealers had used to sell the Model 1 by simply letting it play, was compressed into a space about 2 centimeters wide, inside the listener's skull. Whatever a set of earbuds does well, it does not do that. It cannot. There is no room for it to happen in. So the company adapted, and the adaptation is the strangest sentence in its history. Totem built in-wall speakers, in-ceiling speakers, in-wall subwoofers, powered speakers and soundbars under the KIN name. Products designed to be specified by a custom installer, cut into drywall, painted over, and forgotten. Read that against 1987. A company founded on the conviction that a loudspeaker deserved to be seen, placed carefully, and sat in front of, now selling loudspeakers engineered to disappear into a wall. It was the right business decision. It kept the lights on. It also meant that the fastest growing part of the catalog was the part where nobody was ever going to sit down and listen. Which brings this to the loss that mattered most, and it was not a product and not a factory. It was the chair. Totem's entire commercial model rested on a single physical arrangement. A specialist dealer, a room, 2 speakers on stands, and a customer willing to spend 20 minutes in silence. That was the only place the 3 rules could be proven. They could not be printed. They could not be charted. Nobody was ever going to be persuaded of Rule 3, that a speaker should still be worth owning in 20 years by a photograph. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, that arrangement thinned out across Canada. Specialist shops closed or consolidated. Buying moved to big box floors, where nothing is set up to be listened to. And then online, where nothing is set up at all. The demonstration that had built the company was becoming something a customer had to go out of their way to arrange. The speakers got better. The rooms to hear them in got scarcer. And in the middle of that, the 2 products that had defined the belief reached the end of their runs, though only one of them ended the way it looks. The Manitou signature, the isobaric extremist, was discontinued in 2009. The Model 1 did something else entirely. It stayed in production for decades, sitting quietly in the catalog, letting newer models take the attention, still being built long after most speakers of its generation had been cleared out. For a certain kind of Canadian listener, the simple fact that it was still on the price list was reassuring in a way that had nothing to do with buying one. Then in 2017, Totem retired it and replaced it. The Signature One was released for the company's 30th anniversary, and it represented the largest set of changes ever applied to the design. The cabinet grew by roughly 1.5 inches in every dimension. The original 5.5-inch woofer was replaced by a 6.5-inch unit, taken from the Forest line, with an oversized voice coil and a neodymium magnet. Nominal impedance went to 8 ohms, which made it dramatically easier to drive than anything wearing that name had been before. Bigger box, easier load, a speaker that a normal amplifier could handle, and not one word of the 3 rules changed. That is worth holding on to, because it is the whole difference between this story and most of the others on this channel. What declined in Canada was not Totem. It was the room where Totem won. And still the boxes came out of the building in the northeast of Montreal. And every few years, one of them was small again. Every few years, the company builds a small speaker and calls it an anniversary. The one marked 20 years in 2007. The Signature One marked 30. The Bison series arrived around the 35th. The Loon was introduced as Totem entered its 37th year in business. Not a flagship, not a statement floor stander, a monitor. The smallest thing the company knows how to make. Despaimbacals offered up each time as the summary of everything it has learned. Most manufacturers mark a milestone by building the largest object they can justify. Totem marks one by going back to the box it started with and asking whether it has got any better at it. It has kept going. The Bison series is designed and hand-assembled at the Montreal facility, built around a 5.25-inch driver and a large soft dome tweeter specified for that line alone, with crossovers assembled by hand. More recently, the Tribe Tower Thunderbird arrived at the top of the range, carrying a new 6-inch Torrent developed over roughly 3 years of work, and a graphene dome tweeter mounted on a machined aluminum baffle, 1/4 of an inch thick. Still, after all this time, with no crossover standing between the amplifier and the woofer. Vince Bruzzese remains the owner, president, and chief designer. The second generation is in the business. The company has never been sold. And Rule 3 turns out not to have been a slogan. Open the Totem website, and among the menu items a normal manufacturer devotes to whatever is new, there is a section called Legacy Products, sitting alongside service and parts, and manuals. A pair bought in 1994 still has a page. The specifications are still there. The parts inquiry still goes to a person in Montreal. A loudspeaker must still be worth owning in 20 years. Most companies would have said that in a brochure and then quietly deleted the evidence. Totem left the evidence up. But the clearest measure of what happened here is not on that website at all. It is in every other manufacturer's catalog. In 1987, a small cabinet promising deep bass and a wide soundstage was treated as a marketing claim. Today, it is the default assumption of the entire industry. It is what a bookshelf speaker is expected to do. It is the entire promise of a soundbar. It is printed on the box of every wireless smart speaker sold in every electronics aisle in Canada. The proposition a Montreal mathematics teacher had to demonstrate one listener at a time for 20 years against the visible evidence of the cabinet in front of them is now something manufacturers assume nobody will even question. There is a footnote to all of this, and it is not a flattering one so much as an honest one. A loudspeaker described as made in Canada is, almost always, a Canadian design and a Canadian assembly wrapped around transducers built to order somewhere else. That is true of Totem for much of its catalog, as it is true of nearly every boutique manufacturer on Earth, which is precisely what makes the Torrent strange. It is the one driver the company builds itself, end to end. And it is also the slowest, most labor-intensive, least commercially sensible object Totem produces. The belief was never free. It was paid for in hours, one driver at a time, by people standing at a bench. And there is one last thing which only becomes visible from the end. Rule 2 said a loudspeaker must be right from every seat in the room, not one. A high school teacher arrived at that by sitting in badly set up shops in Montreal and being annoyed. 200 kilometers west, the laboratory in Ottawa spent years arriving at the same place from the opposite direction. Its research found that the loudspeakers listeners consistently ranked highest were the ones that dispersed sound evenly, the ones whose response measured smooth and similar both directly in front of the speaker and off to the sides, which is a chart and a methodology and a peer-reviewed way of saying it has to be right from every seat in the room. The two rooms this story opened in, the chamber and the workshop, the measurement and the belief, had been describing the same loudspeaker the whole time. They were only using different languages to do it. The building in the northeast end of Montreal is still there. Same industrial district, same address, same benches. On a winter morning in the northeast of Montreal, a finished woofer is lifted off a bench and lowered into a cabinet no larger than a stack of books, and the loading door closes behind it on a parking lot full of snow.